Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. A New Mother for Christmas by Emma Ashwood. Eve Jones leaned against her husband as tears streamed over her cheeks. If she had known unconditional love the moment her daughter Jane had been born, she now understood what a broken heart felt like. It felt as if someone had taken her heart and driven a knife into it, over and over again. And just when it felt as if the scars would begin to heal, that knife was turned again. How could she have known that fever and a cough in the middle of winter could be so serious? Eve closed her eyes and thought back to the last few weeks, wondering what she could have done differently to have saved her daughter's life. The first sign of illness had been when Jane had lost her appetite shortly after summer. Although they never had the means to enjoy elaborate meals, her daughter began to turn down even the simplest of meals. Secondly, the night sweats. Regardless of the cool fall weather that swept the streets of New York, Jane had woken up night after night, drenched in sweat and shivering. Eve had become concerned, but there was still not enough indication of illness for her to spend money on an expensive physician. When the fever hit along with the cough shortly after, Eve had known something was terribly wrong. In the area of New York they called home, disease wasn't a distant acquaintance. The wealthier society and businessmen spoke about disease plaguing 5 Points due to the low morality of the drunks, prostitutes, and criminals that lived there. But Jane had been no less than a sweet and innocent child. Eve had always followed the word of God and tried to be an upstanding Christian. Even her husband Henry, who worked long hours at the docks, didn't let a drop of liquor pass his lips. So how was it possible for Jane to fall ill due to their trespasses? So many questions had been left unanswered. The physician had briefly examined her little girl, and at barely 6 years of age, Jane had been diagnosed with the deadly affliction that had already claimed too many lives. Consumption. Over the last few months, Eve and Henry could do nothing but stand by and watch as the illness dragged their daughter a little deeper into its grasp every day. The cough had become so bad that it racked her little body into spasms. The fever and fatigue making it hard for her to so much as play over the last few weeks. But only when she started coughing up blood did Eve know that her daughter wouldn't recover. No amount of prayers, medicine, or love could heal her little girl's lungs. Eve was eternally grateful, however, that Jane passed away in her sleep, rocked in Eve's arms. She hadn't been alone, she hadn't been in pain, and now she was in heaven with their heavenly Father. But that didn't console the heartache and loss that Eve and Henry now had to live with. They watched as the small coffin was lowered into the ground, quiet sobs escaping Eve, knowing that she would never hold her little girl again. The pastor said a few words before he read a beautiful verse from the Bible about children being welcomed into the Lord's embrace. When the funeral was over, Henry slipped an arm over Eve's shoulder for support as they trudged back to the road. It was his way of supporting her, even when he was struggling to bear the weight of his own grief. As they made their way back to their small tenement apartment, just around the corner from Mulberry Bend, they could see families and businesses prepare for Christmas only 2 weeks away. Last year, Eve had also been decorating the house and helping Jane to make a Christmas card for Henry. "It won't be the same, you know," Henry said in his deep baritone voice as snow began to dance in the air. Henry and his family had escaped the Irish famine for a new life and new country. He gets 7%. But Eve knew that their small tenement apartment hadn't been part of that dream with its low-rise ceiling, poor ventilation, and lack of indoor plumbing. But with boatloads of immigrants arriving at the docks every day, work was hard to find. "Yes," Eve nodded with a heavy sigh. "I don't think life will ever be the same again. Never mind Christmas." A family passed them on the street, causing Eve and Henry to both stop to admire what they had once had. The father held his little girl's hand while the mother carried the little boy. "I'm so sorry, Henry," Eve's voice was thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. Henry turned to her with a loving look. There is nothing to be sorry about. This wasn't your fault. It was her time, 'tis all. Eve shook her head. We can't. We'll never be parents ever again. A visceral reaction within her reminded her that she would never bear another child. With the complications of Jane's birth, her womb had ruptured. Although the physician had managed to save Eve's life, she was unable to bear children. We have each other, Henry said as he pulled her close. We have each other and the memories of the sweetest little girl. Eve nodded as she sniffed the tears away. She loved Christmas, Eve said as they walked past a Christmas wreath in a shop display window. She did, Henry agreed, holding her hand. I wish I could have given her a better life, one with a nice warm home in winter, with a yard in the summer, and all the gifts her heart desired for Christmas. I couldn't even give her that. She was loved and cherished, she knew that. Eve smiled sadly at her husband. The slums of New York brought little for which to be grateful. Dreams often never materialized, and on more nights than not, you went to bed either hungry or cold. Life was hard, and now they had lost their only daughter. How did one continue to dream after such a loss? How did one celebrate Christmas? Reaching their rundown tenement apartment, Eve knew she would never have those answers. All she had was Jane's memories, Henry's love, and faith that the Lord would keep them safe and that he had a plan for their future. Hopefully, a plan that didn't include more hardship and more loss, because Eve simply wouldn't be able to stand it if that was the plan. The small Christmas tree they had decorated early for Jane's benefit, knowing she wouldn't make it until the actual day, stood in the corner of the tiny living room. It was the season of celebration and love, but for Eve and Henry, it was the season they had lost their daughter. Sam Williams tapped his foot on the wooden floor with impatience and anxiety. From the back of the house, he could hear his wife wailing in pain and anguish as she brought their second child into the world. The midwife had been called shortly after dawn when the first labor pains manifested. Their first child, Jessica, had been born only a few hours after his wife had gone into labor. But today was different. His wife had been in labor for over 8 hours, and the baby hadn't yet arrived. Now and then, the midwife would come into the living room to update him on the progress of Louisa's labor. All through the morning and afternoon, the midwife came in with a bolstering smile, announcing that the baby would arrive soon. But as twilight took hold of the landscape and the morning star made its appearance, the midwife's smile grew smaller every time she came to talk to Sam. Jessica, at the age of 5, also sensed that something was amiss. Although Sam tried his best not to reflect his concerns onto his little girl, she had been sensitive enough to pick up on it. "Pa, when will I get to meet my baby sister or brother?" Jessica asked, playing with her doll in front of the fireplace. Sam wished he had an answer for her, but judging by the silence that had fallen over the house, he didn't dare lie to his daughter. "I'm not sure, honey. We'll have to wait and see. Mommy is trying her best," Sam said, trying to hide the worry from his voice. When he heard the door creak down the hall, his heart jumped into his throat. He couldn't hear the wails of the baby or the cries of pain from Louisa. Instead, the house was deathly quiet, apart from Jessica speaking quietly to her doll. "I'm sorry, Sam. I did everything I could. She's asking for you," the midwife apologized with tears in her eyes. Sam didn't have to ask. He could read it in her eyes and the silence that overshadowed the house. He glanced at Jessica, and the midwife quickly moved to his daughter's side. "You go on. I'll sit with her." It was with heavy feet that Sam made his way to the bedroom he had shared with Louisa since the day of their wedding. He quietly pushed the door open to see his wife, pale and tired, lying on the bed. The midwife had covered her with sheets to make her presentable, although it was clear to Sam that she wouldn't make it through the night. "Louisa, my love?" Sam asked as he kneeled beside the bed and reached for her cold and lifeless hand. She turned to look at him, her eyes fraught with fear and regret. "I'm so sorry, Sam. I tried. I really tried." "Hush," Sam said, pressing a kiss to her hand. "Don't apologize. The baby is a breach. There is nothing the midwife could have done," Louisa explained as tears quietly seeped from her eyes. It's all right. It's going to be all right, Sam whispered to her. But my baby girl, Jessica, how will she ever be all right without her mother, Sam? Louisa asked, using all her strength. She'll have me. I'll take care of her as best I can. You rest now. Sam felt emotion plug his throat, but he couldn't dare to show weakness now. He had to be strong for his wife, making her way from one life to the next, and then he would need to be strong for his daughter. I love you, Sam. You're a good man. You deserve to be happy. Promise me you'll be happy again? Louisa quietly sobbed. I love you, Louisa. I promise I'll never forget you. I'll make sure that our little girl never forgets you, Sam said, biting back the tears. When there was a soft knock on the door, the midwife stepped inside with Jessica by her side. Come here, Jessica. Mommy wants to talk to you, Sam said, turning to his daughter. Jessica ran towards him, and he scooped her up and placed her beside Louisa on the bed. Sam could see that Louisa was using every ounce of her strength to hug their daughter. Mommy, why are you crying? Jessica asked with the naivety of a child. Mom is just tired, honey. That's all. You know I love you more than the butterflies and the flowers in the fields? Louisa asked quietly. Jessica nodded, although her eyes were clouded with confusion. Where is the baby, Mommy? Mommy needs to rest now, Jessica. Why don't you go play by the fire? Sam said, glancing over Jessica's head at the midwife. The midwife stepped forward and led Jessica out of the room, allowing Sam to spend the last few moments with his wife. He knew there would be time for explanations later, but for now, he wanted to make sure Louisa knew that she was loved. She fell asleep holding Sam's hand and a short while later drew her last breath. Sam allowed himself to weep for almost an hour before he was ready to face the midwife and his daughter. Just the morning before, he had been excited about the arrival of their second child. Never would he have guessed that he would not only lose his unborn child, but the love of his life on the very same day. He found the midwife sitting on the couch, Jessica fast asleep beside her. Sam only had to nod to indicate that Louisa had passed on. The midwife stood up with tears quietly streaming over her cheeks. I'm so sorry for your loss, Sam. Thank you for everything you did. Louisa and I both appreciate that you would come, Sam said, struggling to find the right words, having never been in this situation before. I'll be on my way then. I'll send for the pastor and a couple of men to help you dig in the morning. The midwife collected her purse before she walked out and closed the door behind her. At any other time, Sam would have been concerned about a woman making her way to town alone at this hour of the night, but the only concern he had in his heart at that moment was for the little girl fast asleep on the couch. How would he find the words to explain to her that her mother would never wake up again? How could he explain to her that the baby brother or sister she had been waiting for would never arrive? And above all, he wondered how his baby girl would be able to grow up without her mother. He considered waking her, but decided against it. He had until dawn to mourn and grieve Louisa's passing, because when the sun rose in the east, he needed to be strong for Jessica. 4 months after putting Louisa to rest beneath the old oak tree on the hill, Sam still thought about her every day. It had been hard for Jessica to understand that her mother had died at first, and for weeks she had kept asking when her mother was coming home. But as winter brought with it chill and cold winds, it also brought the realization that her mother was never coming back. It was only a couple of weeks before Christmas, and in the town of El Paso, everyone was preparing for the big day. But on his ranch, a couple of miles outside of town, Sam hadn't even put up a tree yet. How can you put up a Christmas tree and pretend this Christmas would be just like the others? He knew that he had no choice but to move on for the sake of his daughter, but it was as if Louisa was present everywhere. He was reminded of her in his daughter's laughter, her complaints about laundry, ever present whenever Sam had to do the chore. He was reminded of her whenever he cooked in their kitchen, because Louisa had never let him do anything except wash the dishes. She was in the cool breeze, the fire crackling in the hearth, and on the porch late at night when Jessica was fast asleep. But with Christmas approaching, it felt as if she was everywhere. Louisa had made a point of it to make Christmas a special affair every year. Together they would put up a tree and decorated it with berries, candles, and paper decorations until there was barely any tree left to see. She had sewn them each a stocking to hang on the fireplace mantelpiece, threatening Jessica that she would get coal if she didn't mind her mother. Every year over Christmas, she would have told Jessica the story of Jesus' birth and how he had come to be their savior. It was a story that Sam knew by heart, but he knew he could never tell it in the same way as Louisa had. He simply didn't know how to bring happiness into Christmas without Louisa to drive the cheer. Louisa had instinctively known what Jessica would want for Christmas and had always got it right. They would save for weeks to go into town with a single goal: to buy Jessica's gift. It had been Sam's work to distract Jessica while Louisa picked out her gift and hid it in the wagon. And then later in the night, when Jessica was asleep, Sam would always enjoy a cup of coffee while Louisa saw to the gifts. But this year, he didn't even know what to give his little girl. With only 2 weeks to go before Christmas Day, he decided to ask her. After dinner and a bath, Sam tucked Jessica into bed and sat on the chair beside her bed. The lantern shone a soft yellow light through the room as Jessica slipped beneath the covers. Every night, Sam would tell her a bedtime story, mostly ones he thought up during the day. On the nights he didn't tell her a bedtime story, he read a few verses from the Bible. But tonight, there would be no bedtime story or Bible reading. He had a very important question to ask his little girl. Jessica, if you could have anything in the whole wide world, what would it be? Sam asked her with a bright smile. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, not knowing what his daughter would ask for. What if she asked for the most expensive doll there was, and he couldn't afford it? He decided to deal with that when it happened, and for now searched his daughter's face, waiting for her answer while she thought very hard about what she wanted. For Christmas, Daddy? Jessica asked. For now, let's think about Christmas. We have to make sure that Santa Claus knows what to bring, Sam said, leaning forward. Jessica thought for a few moments longer before her face lit up with hope. Daddy, there is only one thing I want for Christmas. Really? Sam asked hopefully. And what would that be? I want Mommy to come back, Jessica said with excitement in her voice. It broke Sam's heart to hear his daughter's greatest wish. He wanted to protect her from heartbreak and loss, but at the young age of 5, she had already lost the most important person in her life. Just when he thought that she had accepted that her mother had passed on, this broke his heart all over again. Jessica, honey, I would like nothing more than that as well. But Mommy can't come back. Her new home is in heaven now, Sam explained patiently. But if Mommy can't come home, can I go to her for Christmas? Jessica asked curiously. No, I'm sorry, honey. You can have anything for Christmas except to see Mommy. Jessica's eyes teared up before she turned away from Sam and began to sob. He put his hand on her back and gently consoled her until the sobs began to ease. He didn't leave her to fall asleep, but sat by her bed all night instead. He wanted her to know that although she couldn't have her mother ever again, she would always have him. Sitting beside her bed, Sam began to pray. Dear Lord, I come before you as a broken man. Louisa was my anchor, my strength, and the love of my life. I don't know how to go on without her. I'm trying to be strong for Jessica. I'm trying to be a good father for her, Lord, but it feels as if I'm failing. Help me, Lord. Help me find a way to push the grief aside and to help my daughter to move on. Give us the strength and the courage to put Louisa in the past whilst cherishing her memory and moving forward. I want to give Jessica a beautiful Christmas, but I'm at a loss as to how to do that. Please, Lord, help me. I beg of you to help me. I don't want my daughter to spend the rest of her life weeping for her mother, but nor do I want her to forget Louisa. I need a little help. I don't know what I need, Lord. I just know that I'm not enough for my little girl. She needs her mother. Sam wept quietly as he tried to think about Christmas. He couldn't get Jessica her greatest wish, but perhaps a doll or two would bring a smile to his daughter's face, even if it only lasted until she remembered losing her mother again. 7%. Eve stepped into the apartment and closed the door behind her. She rolled her shoulders, which were aching and tired after a 12-hour shift at the factory. She didn't complain about the long hours or the effect it had on her body, because having a job was a miracle in itself. Many women would give their last breath to work in a factory, she quickly reminded herself as she moved to the wood stove. She only had a few sticks of firewood left until she received her wages on Friday, and she used them sparingly. She lit the fire with a little wax and a match before she placed the log of wood on top of the kindling. The apartment was cold and damp, and although it wasn't winter yet, Eve already shivered in the evenings when she climbed into bed. Carefully, she set the kettle of water on the wood stove, wondering if tea would be enough to sustain her for the night, since there wasn't much in the way of dinner. Eve glanced at the two shelves that represented her pantry and sighed. There was a piece of stale bread, a handful of flour, and one egg. The egg had been a gift from her neighbor a few days before, and although Eve wanted nothing more than to fry the egg for supper, she convinced herself she could go another day without protein. Rubbing her hands, she stood in front of the wood stove, hoping that the heat would soon start permeating the small apartment. She had sewing to do tonight, and her fingers were clumsy when they were cold. The pricks evident on her fingers were evidence of what happened when she tried to sew with cold hands. She needed to rebutton 2 shirts, shorten a pair of pants, and hem a little girl's dress. It might be 8 o'clock, but she wouldn't get to bed before midnight. In the morning, she needed to be at the factory by 7 o'clock when her shift started. It was a hard life, one she never dreamed of living, but she had no alternatives. The apartment was sparsely furnished with one rickety bed in the corner, a trunk that served as a bedside table, and an old, raggedy rug in front of the bed. She had 2 chairs in the kitchen around a small table, without knickknacks or drapes to speak of. In front of the tiny window that barely let in light even during the summer, she had hung an old sheet that had seen better days. Anything of value had been sold over the last few months. Eve often wished she could have made another plan, but she knew that physical items held no value in heaven. A knock at the door startled her. She turned and let out a sigh, knowing exactly who she would find at her door. The last person she had energy for tonight was her landlord. When she and Henry had moved into the building a year after losing Jane, it had made sense to live in a smaller apartment to save money. Their dream had been to save enough money to leave New York and to head west. But the economy had turned, and the rent had risen exponentially. "I know you're in there, Eve," the burly man shouted as he pounded on the door again. Eve grabbed her coat and made to open the door. Whenever she saw her landlord, she felt the need to cover herself as best she could. The way his eyes lazily inspected her body made her feel self-conscious and dirty. She opened the door with an attempt at a smile. "Good evening, Mr. Brown." "Evening to you too? You got my money?" he asked, his breath reeking of malt beer and fish. Although the economy had turned for the worst, it didn't seem to affect Mr. Brown in the least. Every time Eve saw him, the buttons on his waistcoat seemed to be straining even more. The fabric seemed to be hanging on for dear life, ready to tear at the seams at any minute. His mustache was overgrown and yellowed by smoking tobacco, which also stained his teeth. His nose was bulbous and red with enlarged pores visible even feet away. He looked, simply put, abhorrible. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Brown. I explained to you that I'll only have the rent for you on Friday. I know it's a few days late, but I simply couldn't come up with the money sooner," Eve quickly explained. It felt as if that was all she was doing lately, explaining and apologizing. "Look, Eve, this building is sought after around these parts of town. A reasonable price for a fair apartment, you know. It isn't too much to ask for my tenants to at least pay their rent on time, now is it?" Mr. Brown demanded sweetly. His sweet voice terrified her more than the burly tone and caused an uneasy sensation up her spine. "I know, and as I said, I'm sorry. I'm doing my best. I've got extra sewing coming in tomorrow as well. I promise I'll have the money to you by Friday." "What if I don't want to wait until Friday? What if I want to be paid now? Do you have the money now?" he demanded with a narrowed, beady-eyed look. "No, I don't," Eve admitted resignedly. Then I've got a solution to your problem and mine. Mr. Brown leaned against the door, one foot inside the jam. I know of a way you can pay your rent without spending a single dime. His mouth curved into a salacious grin. No, Eve said firmly. I'd like you to leave now. Come on, Eve, just think about it. A little of your time, you keep the dimes. His laughter was cynical and perverted. Eve tried to find her anger, but only tears came to the fore. She was tired of fighting, tired of every day being a struggle, and tired of not knowing how to change her situation. Henry passed on 2 months ago. What would make you think that I would even consider such a lecherous offer? A tear slipped over her cheek, but she brushed it away furiously. He's gone, ain't never coming back. I can't take good care of you, Eve. All you gotta do is say the word. Mr. Brown continued to make his advances. Eve shook her head. I'd rather be put out on the street, die of hunger and cold, than do what you are asking. You'll have your money on Friday. If that isn't good enough, then I'll find someplace else. Mr. Brown's eyes widened. Hold on there. Didn't say you needed to find another place. You're home here. I ain't gonna take that away from you. Tell you what, I will wait until Friday just to show you the type of upstanding man I am. He winked at her before he turned and walked away. Eve shut the door with a heavy sigh. Mr. Brown's quick retreat made it clear he didn't have any further interest in his building. He was charging an exorbitant rent, and Eve had little option but to pay up or find alternative accommodation. As a widow, no one would take her in. She sat down in front of the wood stove and closed her eyes. She thought about her little girl taken from her by consumption. She thought about Henry, who had been claimed by cancer just 2 months before. But instead of focusing on their deaths, she focused on the time before sadness had made its home on her heart. She remembered the laughter and love that filled their home. She remembered feeling content despite not being at all wealthy. She remembered dreams of the future. When she opened her eyes, she was still sitting beside the wood stove. The apartment, a cold and dank reminder of what her life had become, a hopeless pit of debt and long hours of working at the factory. Aegis. 2 days before Christmas, Eve accepted her envelope of wages. Relief washed over her knowing that she would be able to pay Mr. Brown. She hadn't missed a rent payment since that fateful day that had brought the landlord to her door, and she had no intention of ever doing so again. Before you leave, I'd like to make an announcement, the factory overseer, one Mr. Frank Zimmerman, said, stepping onto a crate so that everyone could see him. Beside Eve, her friend and co-worker Elizabeth reached for her hand and squeezed it hopefully. There had been some talk of an increase in wages for a month. Even the newspapers had supported the efforts of better wages for female factory workers. Here it comes, Eve. Eve smiled hopefully as they waited for Mr. Zimmerman to make his announcement. Following the riots and the bad press due to the unrests related to unfair wages, I've suffered losses that should never have happened. Just like me, other factory owners are taking a stand to protect our own interests. As of next week, any person who even considers taking part in a riot or talking to the press will be relieved of their position. Add to that, to make up for the losses I've experienced in bad workmanship and bad turnaround times on garments, as of next week your wages will be 5% less than today. Gasps of horror could be heard throughout the factory, followed by whispers of Mr. Zimmerman proving himself unreasonable. If you don't agree with my work ethic or the wages I pay, I ask you not to return after Christmas. But be aware that other factories are doing the same. Losing your job here will only mean you will find yourself unemployed. That's all. Thank you. He stepped off the crate and straightened his silk tie. Looking at him, it was clear that the losses he spoke of hadn't affected him in the least. His suit was of the best fabric money could buy. His mustache was professionally trimmed by a barber and maintained with expensive beard oil. His belly was as round as his cheeks, and his eyes sparkled with good nourishment and evil on equal measure. For a few moments, Eve didn't move. If her wages would be even less than they were now, she would never be able to afford her rent. She couldn't even risk leaving to find another job. The only option was to work weekend shifts as well, which meant working at the factory 7 days a week and using the hours at night to take in extra sewing. Eve? Eve, are you all right? You're as pale as a sheet, Elizabeth said, touching her arm. Eve shook her head. I don't know what I'm going to do. Elizabeth pulled her in for a hug to offer quiet support. Elizabeth was the only person who understood Eve's situation. At least Elizabeth had a husband who brought in the bulk of their income. Eve had no one to rely on but herself. Elizabeth stepped back and smiled at Eve. Come on, I'll walk you home. They gathered their coats, scarves, and bags before they braved the cool October wind that swept through the streets. It carried with it the stink of sewers and rotting animals, all mixed with the stench of horse dung. But Elizabeth and Eve no longer even noticed, having become accustomed to the malodorous 5 Points. When they reached Eve's apartment, she put on a kettle of tea. She couldn't really afford to entertain friends, but right now she needed someone to tell her that the dark hole she was stuck in had the promise of light somewhere, because for the life of her she couldn't seem to find it. She joined Elizabeth by the small table with a heavy sigh. I was barely making rent as it is. This week, this entire envelope is going to rent. I won't even have money for food if I don't get some extra sewing in over the weekend. Elizabeth sighed in sympathy. Here, take this. We'll manage without a few dimes. She handed Eve enough money to cover bread and cheese, and if she used it sparingly, perhaps a chunk of ham. No, I can't take your money, Elizabeth. You need it, Eve insisted, although her belly was aching with hunger. Yes, you can and you will, Elizabeth insisted. Eve let out a grateful sigh. Thank you, God bless you. He'll bless you too, Elizabeth smiled. I'm not so sure. My Henry and I had such big dreams. We dreamed of traveling westward, finding a parcel of land, and building a homestead. But then we lost Jane. We resumed that dream a year ago, and now I've lost him as well, Eve admitted quietly. I'm all alone with nothing and no one. Elizabeth reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. Even in the darkest of times, God finds a way to show us the light. You just have to keep faith, Eve. Just keep the faith. I'm sorry. I shouldn't burden you with my troubles. Eve apologized. It's almost Christmas. You should go home and be with your husband. It's not a burden. It's a privilege to have you as a friend, Elizabeth said kindly. You mentioned you had dreams of going out west when Henry was still alive. Why don't you pursue that dream? Eve laughed sadly. Elizabeth, even if I wanted to, I would never be awarded land on my own. Besides, I don't even have enough money for the train fare west. I'm not speaking about a land grant. I'm speaking about finding a new husband, Elizabeth explained evenly. Have you heard about mail-order brides? Eve frowned. Of course I have. Women head west to marry desperate men. No, that isn't it at all. Women correspond with willing suitors until there is an engagement before they travel to the west. Eve, I know you loved Henry very much and that you miss Jane dearly, but don't you think you should at least consider this as an option? Eve thought for a long moment before she let out a heavy sigh. No, it would betray Henry's memory. Not only would I be speaking vows to another man, but I would also be living our dream without him. That simply isn't an option. Elizabeth shrugged. You mean it isn't an option you want to consider? Perhaps, Eve, it's the only option you have. Before Eve could argue or explain that she would find another way to make ends meet, Elizabeth stood up and wrapped her scarf around her neck. I've got to go and start baking the ham for Christmas. Why don't you join us tomorrow for Christmas Eve? I know we're not your family, but I can't stand the thought of you spending Christmas alone. Although Eve was grateful for the invitation, she shook her head. Thank you, but I'll have to kindly refuse. I won't be good company. It's my first Christmas without Henry, my third without Jane. I'd rather stay here and celebrate Christmas with my memories. Elizabeth nodded with understanding. If you change your mind, you know where to come. Elizabeth left and Eve sank onto all fours before her bed and began to weep. Elizabeth was right. Becoming a mail-order bride was her only option, but it was an option she could never face considering, which left her with no options at all. Thank you for coming, Bronwyn, Sam said as he walked into the kitchen on Christmas morning. Bronwyn looked up and smiled from making pancakes at the stove. Stop thanking me, Sam. I should be the one thanking you. I've never got to spend Christmas with my niece before. Sam nodded as he poured himself a cup of coffee. His sister had sent word of her visit a few months ago. With her own children raised and married, she had offered to spend Christmas with him and Jessica. Her husband had stayed home to take care of their ranch over the holidays. Although Bronwyn was over 10 years older than Sam, she was still full of energy and life. The last time she had come to Sam's ranch in El Paso had been after Louisa's funeral. Sam hoped that having Bronwyn here this Christmas would make it easier on him and Jessica. While Jessica is still asleep, I think it's only right that you know what she told me last night when I asked her what she wanted for Christmas, Bronwyn said as she stacked pancakes into a plate and handed them to Sam. Sam let out a heavy sigh. You don't have to tell me. I know exactly what she wants for Christmas. It's been the same wish since we lost Louisa. Bronwyn's eyes softened as she met Sam's gaze. It's been more than a year, Sam. You can't keep living in the past. It's not good for you, and it's not good for Jessica either. I'm not living in the past. I get up every day, I take care of the cattle, I take care of my daughter, and at night I plan what I have to do the next day, Sam said flatly. You're going through the motions, but you're not living, Sam. Far from it. You wander around with a hollow look in your eyes, and that poor little girl misses her mother something terrible. It's time for you to think of the future. And what better time to do it than at Christmas? Bronwyn asked, with a hand on her hip. How do you expect me to think about the future when I'm just struggling to get through every day without breaking down and spending too much time beside Louisa's grave? It's normal to grieve, Bronwyn. You're lucky that you haven't needed to. Sam's voice held an edge of anger, but his sister didn't back down. Yes, you're right. I haven't lost my husband. My children were blessed to have both their parents. But we faced other challenges, Sam. We faced months during which we had no food on the table, when we had to rely on the charity of our neighbors to get us through. But we looked to the future, and we got back on our feet, Bronwyn said firmly. The Lord gives us each our unique challenges in life, and it's how we deal with them that matters. The tests are true character and faith. Do you think you are passing that test, Sam? Sam let out a heavy sigh. Bronwyn, why didn't you tell me things were so hard for you? Bronwyn simply shrugged. You and Louisa had just married. I was not about to put the burden of my family's troubles on your shoulders. If this is a test of character and faith, why does it feel like I'm failing? Sam asked quietly. Because you haven't even considered any options other than to grieve what you lost, Bronwyn said plainly. That little girl needs a mother, and you need to find joy again. They don't really sell those in town. Sam's voice was flat and filled with sarcasm. Good morning, sleepyhead, Bronwyn said brightly as Jessica appeared in the kitchen. She gave her younger brother a firm look, making it clear that the conversation wasn't over. Is it Christmas yet? Jessica asked hopefully. Yes, honey, it's Christmas. Would you like Christmas pancakes for breakfast? Bronwyn offered, scooping Jessica into her arms. It was easy for Sam to see how much Jessica enjoyed the female attention. She missed having a mother of her own to dote on her, spoil her, and spend time with her. Ever since Bronwyn had arrived, Jessica had been following her like a shadow. While the two of you have Christmas pancakes, I've got to check on the animals in the barn. Last night was a cold one, Sam said as he stood and grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. He glanced over his shoulder one last time and wondered if Bronwyn might be right. Was it time he started thinking about the future? Later that night, they were sitting by the fire, Jessica's excitement tangible as they waited to open their gifts. Sam had gone to the trouble of getting a few gifts for Jessica instead of just one. He had bought her a vanity mirror, a new doll, a box of crayons, and a book in which to draw. He and Bronwyn watched as Jessica opened gift after gift. Bronwyn had spoiled her with a hairbrush and a new dress. By the time Jessica had opened all her gifts, a smile hadn't yet reached her face. What's wrong, honey? Bronwyn asked, concerned. Jessica shrugged sadly. I was hoping for a mommy. Bronwyn got up and gave Jessica a warm hug before she retrieved a small box from under the tree. She walked over to Sam and dropped it in his lap. I believe this is yours. Sam felt horrible for not getting Bronwyn a gift as he untied the ribbon. Inside the box was 3 new handkerchiefs, on top of which was a note. Widower from El Paso seeks wife. Sam Williams, a cattle rancher from Texas, is seeking a kind-hearted and gentle soul to be his companion and a mother to a 6-year-old daughter. After losing his beloved wife, Sam has become lonely and has realized that a little girl needs a mother. 6-year-old Jessica is curious with a sharp mind and a big heart. She enjoys picking wildflowers and singing nursery rhymes, which she used to do with her mother. If you feel that you can adapt to the wide-open plains, the warmer weather, and life on a cattle ranch, perhaps you are just the person Sam needs. He is seeking someone who can offer him friendship and companionship and become a mother to his daughter. Although not wealthy by any means, he can provide a stable home and the promise that his wife will never go hungry. He is seeking a woman between the ages of 25 and 35 to answer his advertisement. He will correspond only with the woman he feels will fit into his home and his heart. Sam looked up and met his sister's gaze with a questioning look. Jessica was eagerly brushing her doll's hair, completely oblivious to the conversation between the adults. "There is an addressed envelope as well," Bronwyn said, nodding towards the box. Sam lifted the handkerchiefs and saw the envelope addressed to the Matrimonial Times. He knew about the newspaper in which men from the West advertised for brides from the East, but had never even considered doing so himself. He turned to Bronwyn with a confused expression, prepared to tell her that she had wasted her time in writing this advertisement. But before he could, Bronwyn cocked a brow. "Perhaps next year Jessica will ask for something else for Christmas." If Sam had wanted to argue, those words took the fight right out of him. Bronwyn was right. He needed to do something to make his little girl happy again and to help her to find the joy of being a child again. It wasn't something he would have done on his own, but as a gift to his daughter, Sam knew he would mail the letter on the day after Christmas. Although the heavy snowfall brought relief from the icy winds that tore through New York in winter, it didn't bring any relief for Eve's feet. She was long overdue for new shoes, and walking through the mud and snow had soaked her socks right through. She wiggled her toes, hoping she would be home in time to rescue them from frostbite as she hurried home. After Mr. Zimmerman had lowered their wages, Eve had taken in extra sewing to be done during the evenings and on weekends, regardless of working 7 days a week. She was bone-tired and had lost so much weight that a brisk breeze might just sweep her off her feet. But she had no option other than to keep working into the early hours of the morning, only to show up for her shifts at the factory on time every morning. The dimes jingled in her pocket, having delivered 3 pairs of mended trousers to a customer. The man had heard about her sewing services through a friend and had been so impressed by her neat work and timeless delivery that he had paid her almost double her asking price. Eve knew that the few dimes would go a long way to helping her pay the rent the following week, but she needed food more than she needed to plan ahead. She trudged through the mud and sleet of Mulberry Bend, hoping that she would not be robbed of her precious earnings by a local gang. She made a turn to stop in at a grocery store run by an Italian emigrant who barely spoke English, but who sold the best bread in all of 5 Points. She splashed out on a complete loaf of bread and a small block of cheese, knowing she'd still have the small change to spare as she walked to the counter to pay the proprietor. She reached him and noticed the Matrimonial Times stacked on the counter beside him. She glanced at the date and realized it had been delivered today. Eve shook her head, knowing full well that paying for a copy was a waste of time but when her tummy growled hungrily, she knew that although she would eat well tonight, she would be back on measly rations in a few days. She thought back on Elizabeth's words before Christmas and wondered if it wasn't time for her to consider the option. "You pay? Yes or no?" the Italian asked in broken English. Eve nodded as she handed him the bread and the cheese. At the last minute, she grabbed a copy of the Matrimonial Times and handed it to him as well. She paid him and collected her purchases before she faced the snow and mud on the sidewalk once again. She tucked the newspaper under her coat, not wanting the print to run in the heavy snowfall. Despite spending her scarce earnings on frivolities, she felt a tiny flicker of hope for the first time since losing Henry. In her heart, she knew she would never find love again, but just maybe she had a chance to have a home and a family again. Walking the rest of the way home, Eve finally realized that she couldn't survive another winter without heat or food. If she had to catch even the faintest cold now, she wouldn't be strong enough to recover. She was fading away without even being ill. The question wasn't whether or not she wanted to betray Henry's memory, it was whether or not she wanted to live. When she arrived at her apartment, she set the newspaper on the table before adding another log to the wood stove. If anything, she promised herself she could use the newspaper for kindling if she changed her mind. But after one bite of the freshly baked bread, Eve knew she couldn't change her mind. She needed to change her life, and just maybe the Matrimonial Times could help her do just that. For 2 days, Eve didn't so much as touch the newspaper on the small table in her kitchen. Every time she considered paging through it, feelings of guilt overwhelmed her. On the 3rd day, she arrived home to realize she had no extra sewing to work on that evening. She did not mind the night of rest, but she could feel anxiety tense her muscles, knowing that without the extra sewing, she wouldn't be able to pay her rent the next week. She ate the last piece of Italian bread despite it being stale. As she chewed on the dry bread, swallowing it down with a cup of tepid tea, Eve gathered the courage to pick up the newspaper for the very first time. If she had expected a certain type of man desperate enough to find a wife in the newspaper, she had been wrong. The advertisements she read didn't come across as desperate, all showing a hopeful tone. Young men wanting company in the homesteads in which they had just settled, merchants looking for someone to build a life with in a new town. Other advertisements were an honest declaration of hope in finding true love. She found herself skipping over those after reading just a few sentences. Then there were the men who used the Matrimonial Times to find a wife. These men had suffered losses in life. He had found himself lonely after losing a loved one and was now at the point where he sought companionship and friendship instead. Eve began to seek out these advertisements and felt her heart clench as she read how these men just hoped to find happiness again. She understood how they felt. But when she came across the advertisement placed by a man named Sam Williams, her heart simply stopped. Where Eve had lost her husband and her daughter, Sam had lost his wife. His letter was a request for someone to be a mother to his daughter and a companion to him. There was no mention of love, only that he sought someone kind-hearted and gentle to help him raise his little girl. Eve felt a tear slip over her cheek as she remembered Jane. Sam's little girl had been more or less Jane's age when he lost his wife. Although no one could ever replace the child she had with Henry, Eve missed being a mother. She may never be able to offer Sam her heart, but she knew that she could at least be a good mother to his daughter. Feeling hopeful, she found a sheet of writing paper and a pen and began to write to this man whom she had never met. Dear Mr. Williams, I'm so terribly sorry to learn about your loss. I understand only too well the feelings that go with losing the person with whom you thought you would have a future. I can't imagine how hard it must be for your daughter, or for you to take on the role of both parents. I too have suffered losses in my life, and I too feel the burden of loneliness. I lost my daughter when she was only 7, 3 years ago. The consumption took her before she had a chance to fight back. My husband and I tried to move on, but losing our daughter was a constant companion until he passed away 6 months ago. I now find myself in a situation where loneliness is overwhelming and poverty has become too much to bear. Regardless of working 7 days a week sewing in a factory, I also take in private sewing after hours. This winter has been the longest of my life. I don't mean to burden you with my sorrows, merely to explain why I find myself writing to a man whom I've never met. Just like you, I can't imagine ever again finding the love I shared with my spouse, but I know now that I have to move on, that through faith and courage, I have to look to the future. I can't be a mother to my daughter or a wife to my Henry, but I can be a mother to your little girl. I promise that I will be a constant source of support, a companion in the lonely times, and a hard worker when it comes to keeping your house and helping on your ranch. You mentioned that you were looking for someone kind-hearted and gentle, and although I find it hard to describe myself, I shall do my best. I was a patient mother with a gentle but firm hand. I enjoyed cooking, sewing, and caring for my family. As you can tell by the hours I work, I have never been one to rest on my laurels, waiting for better days to come. I'm a hard worker, honest, and loyal. If you find that the qualities I've described above are not suitable to your needs, I wish you all the best in the future. I wish for you the good fortune of finding a mother deserving of your daughter and a companion who will offer you friendship and support in the future. My very best wishes, Eve Jones. Eve folded the letter and placed it in an envelope before addressing it. It was just after 10 p.m., and although she knew Mowbray Bend would be dangerous after dark, she found the courage to walk that way regardless. She dropped the letter into the mailbox in front of the post office and let out a sigh of hope. She didn't know if her letter to Sam Williams would yield results or a lack of response that could last an eternity, but she had to hope that he might at least reply. On the walk home, Eve could hear the shouts and screams of men and the sound of gunshots ringing in the air. This was what 5 Points had become. It had become the home of bandits, disease, and poverty. Knowing that Mowbray Bend wouldn't be safe, she had no option but to take the long route home. She bundled her coat tightly over her chest as she trudged through the fresh snow. Frightened that trouble might find her on her way, she began to pray quietly. She prayed for guidance, safekeeping, and God's grace to help her find happiness in the future. When she finally arrived home, it was just after midnight. She pulled off her shoes, only to notice that the soles were torn and her socks were soaked with icy water, her toes already red and swollen. Knowing she had no choice but to treat them immediately to prevent frostbite, she put a pot of water on the wood stove to heat. When small puffs of steam rose from the water, she waited until it was cool enough to touch before she submerged her feet. Pain shot through her body like an arrow, but she didn't dare withdraw her feet just yet from its depths. She waited until the pain began to ease before she carefully eased her feet from the water and dried them one by one. She had a little balm that Elizabeth had given her for Christmas and used the last of it on her toes. After slipping into 4 pairs of socks, all she owned, Eve climbed into bed and dreamed of a future in which she wouldn't be cold, hungry, or poor. Sam sat on his porch and watched as Jessica played in the wildflowers that had come into bloom beside the house. Spring in Texas brought with it a myriad of colors carpeted in scent and textures across the landscape. Bluebonnets, Indian paintbrushes, evening primrose, and beautiful buttercups surrounded his daughter. Jessica's laughter traveled to him on the wind along with the scent of spring. Ever since Bronwyn had come to visit over Christmas, it was as if he and Jessica had finally started to move on. He no longer visited Louisa's grave every day, and Jessica no longer asked for a mother every night. In a way, it was sad to know that they were moving on without Louisa. But in his heart, Sam knew this was the right path for them to have found on which to go forward. When Bronwyn handed him the advertisement for the matrimonial times over Christmas, Sam hadn't thought much would come of it. But in early February, the letters had started to arrive. One by one, Sam had read them before discarding them in the fireplace to burn. He couldn't imagine ever finding a companion or a mother for his little girl, until he received the letter from Eve Jones in New York. Sam couldn't be sure if it was the way in which Eve described herself or the losses she had suffered, but Sam felt an instant connection after reading her words. He had written back, not thinking anything would come of it, and had been corresponding with Eve ever since. Through her letters, Sam could tell that she was kind, and how terribly she missed her husband and daughter. Just like Sam, she wasn't looking for a love match, but rather a chance for companionship and a new life in which she didn't have to work her fingers to the bone for little recompense. Sam had heard how expensive it was to survive in New York, especially since residents couldn't grow their own vegetables or meat for the table. Everything on their tables had to be bought, making life almost impossible for all but the wealthy. Although Sam had sympathy for her situation, it wasn't that which urged him to open her letters when they arrived. It was rather the feeling of having someone to talk to again, someone with whom he could share Jessica's achievements, and someone to whom he could admit how intensely he missed Louisa. They had been corresponding for 3 months, and every time received a letter from Eve. Like today, he waited for the sunset to appear in the west before he took his position on the porch to read her words. While Jessica played in the field of wildflowers, Sam unfolded Eve's letter. "Dear Sam, I can only imagine the beauty of spring in Texas. Your description of the wildflowers and the warm breeze causes me to yearn for a place I do not even know. New York has few trees, and these have given life to new leaves, while here and there one notices a flower seeking out sunlight from a window box. Instead of the scent of wildflowers and new life, New York is overwrought with ocean breezes carrying the odor of rotting food and fish off the docks. Jessica seems delighted by the wildflowers. I can only imagine that my little girl would have been delighted by them as well. Please make sure she wears a bonnet whenever she plays out in the field. The skin of a little girl is so sensitive, and you wouldn't want sunburn to blemish her porcelain skin. As a cattle rancher, spring must be a busy time of the year for you. From your last letter, I understand that this must be your calving season. I am yet to see a calf or a cow, for that matter. I imagine I would be terrified at the sight of such a large beast. Receiving your letters has become a much anticipated event. I feel that you understand me, and might I be so forward as to say that I understand you. I enjoy hearing about the ranch, Jessica, and your plans for the future. Before we continue our correspondence, Sam, there is something I think you should be aware of. I know your advertisement mentioned that you were looking for a companion and a mother for Jessica. Given the opportunity, I would gladly be both. But unfortunately, should you want to bring children into a union in the future, I am unable to oblige. Jane's birth resulted in complications I'd rather not mention, but my ability to have children was affected in the worst way. If you choose not to continue writing to me because of this, I will understand. A man seeks an heir to whom to leave his heritage, an heir I cannot provide. I won't blame you in the least if you would rather find a woman who can bear you children. I thoroughly enjoy our correspondence and hope to continue as we are, but if I do not hear from you again, I wish you and Jessica God's greatest blessings for the future. Kindest regards, Eve." Although Sam had never met Eve, he could only imagine the burden on a woman knowing she could never bear a child, especially having lost her only child. His heart swelled with affection and sympathy for the woman he had never met. Although he and Louisa had planned more children in the future, Sam couldn't imagine turning Eve away for matters beyond her control. He would have welcomed a sibling for Jessica, but would far rather bless his daughter with a good mother and a suitable companion for himself than a childbearing woman who failed to understand them. Besides, if they decided in the future on having another child, adoption was a definite consideration. In Texas alone, so many orphanages were filled with children needing loving homes. But that wasn't something he would think of right now. For now, he wanted to reassure Eve that her shortcomings would not affect their relationship in the least. He pulled the pad of paper and a pen closer and began to write. "Daddy, look, butterflies!" Jessica cried out with joy. Sam smiled at his daughter and knew that he couldn't imagine living his life without her. That only brought more respect for Eve. He had suffered losses, but Eve's losses had been greater, and yet she still found the courage and the faith to dream of a future. My dearest Eve, as I sit here and pen this letter, Jessica is chasing butterflies. I haven't told her about our correspondence, but I know that she will come to like you, just as I have. I wish I could send a field of wildflowers within this letter, if only it was possible. But for now, I will include a blue bonnet for you to keep as a reminder of the day I wrote this letter. I'm sorry to hear about the complications with Jane's birth. Please do not feel that your inability to bear children has any effect on the feelings of affection that I've developed for you. I would rather find a companion and friend with whom I feel a connection than a childbearing woman who understands neither Jessica nor myself. You are right. Calving season has kicked off on the ranch. I can still remember the first time I saw a calving. It is truly wonderful to see a calf burst forth and take its first breath. What is even more fascinating is the newborn managing to stand up and suckle within minutes of birth. Ranching with cattle is a humble man's work. One day you feel more joy than you ever imagined, especially when you have cows roaming the field with their young. The next, you might lose a cow during calving, and along with it, the opportunity to have sold her in the future. Louisa used to plant a small kitchen garden with vegetables and herbs every year. Last summer, I simply couldn't gather the courage to do it myself. This year, I plan to involve Jessica to help me plant the garden again. There is no feeling more rewarding than harvesting fresh tomatoes from your own garden. Process them. The scent of them after they have baked in the sun all day simply makes one's mouth water. I look forward to hearing from you again, but I will end this letter by saying the following. Although neither you or I know what the future holds, I have learned to focus on the present. Presently, I take great joy in receiving your letters and learning more about you and what you enjoy. Perhaps one day we will have the privilege of meeting, and we can sit on this very porch and reminisce over the letters that brought us together. I will ask Jessica to pick you a bluebonnet. Through that, you will have something of her with you as well. All my best, Sam. Jessica, do you want to help me pick a bluebonnet? Sam asked as he left the porch. Jessica ran to him with a curious look. But why, Daddy? They're pretty in the field? Sam felt a smile curve his mouth as he spoke to his daughter. Because I'm writing a letter to a friend who doesn't have any bluebonnets where she lives. I thought you and I could pick her one and press it between 2 pages, and that way when she receives the letter, she'll have a little something of us to keep. Jessica's eyes lit up. And it will still be pretty when she gets it? Yes, pretty as a bluebonnet, Sam said, taking his daughter's hand and walking her into the field. Eve soaked her hands in warm salt water. The salt water stung with a vengeance, managing to find every cut, needle stab, and blister on her cold and calloused hands. A tear quietly slipped over her cheek when she remembered a time when her hands were soft and warm. A time when Jane had held her hand and said that her hands were the softest in the entire world. Now Eve could hardly stand to look at them. The last year had taken its toll on her health, her hands, and her figure. The dresses that had fit her perfectly before she lost Henry were now oversized and hanging from her frame like loose rags. She kept her hands in the water until the pain started to ease. When she finally pulled them out, she carefully dried them on a soft rag before she sparingly applied her herbal balm. She wasn't sure of the contents of the balm, but it smelled terrible. She suspected some kind of animal fat mixed with wax and herbs to heal the calluses, cuts, and blisters on her skin. Elizabeth had gifted it to her earlier that day, knowing she couldn't afford to buy it for herself. The soup was simmering on the stove, and although it was without meat, Eve knew that the rich vegetable broth would give her the nutrients and vitamins she needed. Once she had finished sipping on the pale liquid, she rinsed her dish before taking a seat at the table. She had received another letter from Sam, and although she couldn't wait to read his words, she had first finished her sewing work for the evening before she indulged in this highlight. Over the last few months, the letters had arrived more frequently, each one more honest than the last. Although they had yet to meet, Eve felt as if she knew Sam personally. In every letter, he told her a little more about Jessica, and in her mind's eye, she could almost picture the 7-year-old girl on the ranch. She had carefully tucked the pressed bluebonnet safely away that they had sent her in the spring, and kept it as a reminder that she was not alone. That somewhere in Texas, a father and a daughter existed who cared about her. She wasn't sure if their correspondence would ever lead to anything more, but as Sam had said in a letter a few months ago, for now, she was focused on the present. My dearest Eve, when I sat to pen this letter, I wanted to tell you about winter taking a hold of Texas. I wanted to tell you about the Christmas traditions we had when Louisa was still alive, and how Jessica enjoyed Christmas. But it only took me a moment to realize that instead of telling you anything else about myself, about Jessica, or about our ranch, I'd rather you be here to experience it for yourself. I never thought that I would ever be ready to accept another woman into my life, but these last few months have taught me that one must never ignore opportunities when they arise. From the first moment I read your words back in February, I knew that opportunity had revealed itself to me. It has taken me all this time to realize that you are the mother and companion I would like to share in our lives. Eve, I would have preferred to do this in person, but I hope that the words you are about to read come across as earnest, honest, and written with affection. Herewith, I ask for your hand in marriage. I ask that you will share my happiness and woes, my troubles and my achievements for the rest of our natural lives. I ask for you to be a mother to my daughter, to raise her with kindness and love. I ask that you leave your life in New York to start a new life in Texas with me. In this envelope, I have enclosed a postal order. I hope you find it generous enough to cover your train fare and any other expenses you might have on your journey westward. Since I am eager for you to arrive, I hope that you will send me a telegram to inform me of your decision. I truly look forward to starting our life together and becoming a family. Affectionately yours, Sam. Eve felt her heart explode with joy as a tear slipped over her cheek. Hope blossomed in her mind as she allowed herself to picture a future with a family once again. A future in Texas, far from Mulberry Bend and Five Points and New York. She clutched the letter to her chest, wondering if she should pack or start cleaning her apartment for the new tenants. Then she noticed that something had fallen to the floor when she had taken the letter from the envelope. She set Sam's letter down and picked it up, a smile settling on her face as she recognized the writing of a child. Dear Eve, I can't wait for you to be my new mommy. You can braid my hair and I will help you cook. Jessica laughter bubbled from Eve's throat, realizing that Sam had to be certain of his decision to propose to her if he shared the decision with his daughter. She reached for the envelope to find the postal order inside, generous enough by far to cover her the train fare, a telegram, and the few new garments she would need for her new life as a rancher's bride. Eve let out a sigh of contentment, relief, and joy as she closed her eyes to say, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I know that I struggled to keep my faith after losing both Henry and Jane, but now you have blessed me with a new family and a new life. I praise your generosity and grace. Amen." Eve placed the letters back into the envelope before she moved to the bed and pulled out her only trunk. The following morning, Eve had finished packing everything she wanted to take with her to Texas. She only packed her best dresses and a few personal items. It was time for a new beginning, meaning she didn't want to take too much of her old life with. She had taken Jane's baby blanket as the only tangible reminder of her little girl. To remember Henry, she had packed the Bible he had read every night. With her trunk packed and her tenement apartment clean, Eve dressed for a day in town. She wasn't heading to the factory this morning. Mr. Zimmerman had never treated her in a way that made her feel as if she should give him notice or even explain the reasons for her leaving. He only owed her 2 days' wages, and she wasn't going to bother to try to get that out of him. Eve knew too well that he would probably apply deductions anyway, and so she just let it be. Firstly, she stopped by the landlord to inform him of her departure. With her extra sewing money, she had managed to pay her rent in full the week before, which meant that she didn't owe him a single dime. She quickly negotiated an amount she felt fair for the furniture and items she would leave behind, knowing that he would sell it on to the next tenant. With more money in her purse, she headed to the better part of town. She headed firstly to the train station to secure her train ticket. She had an option of leaving in 2 days or that very afternoon. Eager to leave New York, Eve purchased a ticket for later that afternoon. Knowing she was pressed for time, she hurried to the post office to send Sam a telegram before stopping at a garment store to purchase 2 new dresses. The dresses were rather simple but would fit her perfectly. A light pink with white polka dots and a lace collar, and the other a fair blue with white trim. Eve decided to wear the blue dress on her arrival in El Paso. Lastly, she headed to the cemetery. It was almost as hard on Eve as their funerals had been. She stood by the graves of her husband and her child and said her final farewell as she promised never to forget them. With tears streaming over her cheeks and a heavy heart, Eve headed back to 5 Points to collect her trunk for her journey to the west. The journey would take 8 days, and although the train was a much safer option than a stagecoach, Eve couldn't imagine doing nothing for so long after a year of working up to 16 hours every day. A brief glance at her hands made her sigh. Hopefully, her hands would be in a better condition by the time she arrived on Sam's ranch. She packed the final items in her trunk, rolling the blue dress small enough to fit in her purse. Armed with a carpet bag and a trunk, Eve closed the door of the tenement apartment behind her, knowing that it was finally time for her to leave New York for good. She would write to Elizabeth from El Paso to explain what had happened, hoping to stay in contact with her good friend. Damberson. After 8 days of being confined to the small train cars, surrounded by people at all times, Eve was ready to reach her destination. Only her seat on the train had been included in her second-class fare. For the duration of the journey, she had nibbled on dried beef, dried fruit, and the few oranges she had splurged on before leaving New York. When they had stopped in small towns along the way, boasting nothing but a small station and a few cabins housing the townsfolk, Eve had made a quick visit to a local merchant. There she had managed to buy fresh bread and cooked ham. It wasn't strange for Eve to eat so little, and she had more than some of the passengers on the train. Some of the wealthier passengers had taken the time to dine in a small diner or boarding house, but Eve couldn't afford the luxury. Instead, she would sit on the train and count the minutes until their journey would resume. She had watched from her window as the landscape changed with every mile they traveled. The lakes and estuaries of New York had turned into vast open grazing land before becoming rugged with mountains and lush overgrowth. From there, the brush had become paler and less, and the mountains disappeared. It seemed as if they had journeyed into a desert, a country with vast open plains, cool winds, and nothing but brown grass and brush as far as the eye could see. Sam had described Texas to her over the last year, but from what she could see from the window of her train, she wondered if he had been accurate in his descriptions. Snow was falling in New York, the streets a sludge of mud after the precipitation, but in Texas, the earth was crying out for a drink of water. When the last day of her journey dawned, Eve had found a restroom to prepare herself for meeting her new family for the first time. The restroom was filthy and foul-smelling after the long train journey, but she managed to wash and change before she returned to her seat. Her nerves began to fray as they drew closer to El Paso, wondering if she would be all Sam expected her to be. He had only described himself as tall with black hair, but what if he looked completely different? Anxiety grew until she could see a town in the distance. There were small hovels on the outskirts with beautiful homes as they passed into the city. The homes were spaced rather than standing on top of each other like the row houses and tenement apartments of New York. Simultaneously, excited and terrified, Eve drew in a deep breath when the train rolled to a stop beside the platform. A few people began gathering their belongings as they made their way to the front of the car to disembark. Eve sat for a few moments, praying that she had made the right decision before she did the same. She disembarked and collected her trunk from the porter before she moved to the platform to find Sam. Only then did she realize that if Sam didn't arrive to meet her, she would be stranded with nowhere to go. She didn't have enough money to return to New York, and she doubted she had enough to even cover room and board for more than a couple of nights. She felt something tug at her dress and felt her heart lift as she looked down to see a little girl standing beside her. Without even asking, Eve knew it was Jessica. She could tell from the freckles on her nose, the golden blonde hair sun-bleached from playing outdoors, and the bright blue eyes that Sam had told her reminded her of a clear sky. For Eve, it was love at first sight. "Hello, you must be Jessica." Jessica's eyes widened exponentially. "You know my name?" I do. I also received your letter. I'm Eve, Eve said, lowering herself to Jessica's eye level. I wrote it all by myself, Jessica said proudly. That's very smart of you, Eve laughed. No little girl could ever replace Jane, but Eve felt her heart lift with joy to have a little girl in her life again. Can I hug you? Jessica asked with a frown. Eve smiled and opened her arms. I'd like that very much. That was how Sam came upon them, holding each other as if they were meant to be together. He cleared his throat, and Eve looked up to see a handsome man standing beside them. His gaze was warm before it narrowed slightly as he looked at Jessica. Didn't I tell you to wait for me? Jessica pouted. But you walked too slow. Sam chuckled as Eve straightened herself to meet her intended husband. Hello, Sam. Eve, he said her name as if it was a prayer. It's a great pleasure to finally meet you. The pleasure is all mine, Eve returned. He was taller than she imagined and had the same piercing blue eyes as his daughter. His frame was broad, and his eyes were guarded by thick brows. Eve had never imagined she would ever be attracted to a man again, but when Sam smiled shyly, as uncertain as Eve about what to say next, her heart simply skipped a beat. Here, let me take your bag. It's an hour's ride home, Sam said, taking her trunk. That far? Eve asked, surprised. Sam had mentioned he lived a distance from El Paso, but she hadn't imagined it would be that far. Not far at all. I just don't like pushing the horses too much when I have passengers, Sam explained as he led the way to the wagon. I've arranged for the pastor to wed us in the chapel this afternoon, just a small ceremony before we return to the ranch. Eve nodded. It wouldn't be appropriate for her to take up residence on Sam's ranch without being married. Jessica tugged on Eve's hand. Daddy said I can be a girl flower. Eve laughed affectionately. A flower girl, perhaps? Yes, that one, Eve said excitedly as she jumped onto the wagon. Sam placed her trunk on the wagon and moved towards Eve to help her up. He held her hand as she reached for her skirts before hoisting herself up. Just the brief touch made her tingle with delight. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, Eve knew she had made the right decision. She might never find love again, but she had found a kind man to be her husband and a wonderful little girl to whom she could be a mother. How was your journey? Sam asked as he took the reins. Eve turned to him with a hesitant smile. Long and uncomfortable, but that doesn't matter. I'm here now. I was thinking that you might want to freshen up when you arrived, so I've arranged for a room at the boarding house that you can use before the ceremony, Sam offered. Only if you want, of course. Not that I think that you need to freshen up, he sighed. I'm sorry, I'm not sure how this works. Eve chuckled softly. Neither do I. I'd appreciate a bath and a change of clothes if you don't mind. I promise I won't take too long. I don't mind at all, Sam said kindly. I thought we might have dinner in town before we head back to the ranch. At the diner? Say yes, Eve. Please say yes, Jessica urged from behind her. Sam laughed. She loves the cake. Then it's a yes, Eve said with a smile over her shoulder. When they arrived in town, Eve could feel the curious glances as the townsfolk watched them drive by. Sam stopped in front of the boarding house and explained who she should ask for before showing her the chapel directly across the road. Eve nodded gratefully before collecting her trunk and heading inside. She introduced herself as Eve Jones and realized that it would probably be for the last time. Before the sun set, she would be Eve Williams. Prosody. The thought made her tummy dance with nerves, but she only had to think of Jessica and Sam for it to ease. Had Sam had an image in his mind of Eve, he would have been wrong. In her letters, she had described herself as having brown hair and unremarkable brown eyes. But having met her, Sam knew that she had misrepresented herself. Her hair was more the color of roasted chestnuts with hints of gold under the sunlight. Her eyes were hazel and sparkled whenever a smile crossed her lips. He could tell by her dress and her tiny wrists that gaining a few more pounds would do her good. The moment he saw her, Sam wanted to protect her from feeling scared or hungry ever again. He paced back and forth in the small chapel while he waited for her to arrive. He wasn't nervous so much as baffled at his good fortune at securing such a beautiful wife and mother for his child through the matrimonial times. He would write to Bronwyn as soon as dawn broke the following day to thank her for pushing him to advertise for a mail-order bride and to tell her how wonderful Eve seemed to be. What caught his heart in a vice grip was seeing Jessica react to her. His daughter, who was usually shy with strangers, accepted Eve as if she had known her whole life. Jessica waited by the door, keeping an eye out for Eve, appearing just as excited as Sam for the wedding to take place. When he had explained to Jessica that she was going to have a new mother, he had expected her to be reticent or angry at him for replacing Louisa. Instead, his daughter had surprised him by thanking him and expressing her excitement at having a family again. Jessica's delightful voice echoed through the chapel as she announced Eve's arrival. Sam took his place beside the pastor and waited for Eve to join him at the altar. Eager to be a part of the ceremony, Jessica held Eve's hand as she made her way down the aisle. She had changed into a pink dress, her face looking refreshed after the testing journey. Seeing Jessica and Eve walking towards him hand in hand made Sam's breath catch. It simply felt right. For a moment, he felt as if he might be betraying Louisa by saying vows to another, but he only had to look at the joy on Jessica's face to know that he was doing right by them all. After introducing Eve to the pastor spoke a few kind words of welcome before he asked Sam to repeat the vows after him. Sam met Eve's eyes and began to speak. "In the name of God, I, Sam, take you to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until parted by death. This is my solemn vow." He could see Eve's eyes shining with emotion and knew that she probably felt the same as he did about Jane about Henry. He squeezed her hands when it was her time to say her vows. With a soft and gentle voice, Eve repeated after the pastor without hesitation until the very end. The pastor smiled at them both when Eve had finished. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Jessica squealed with joy as she hugged first her father and then Eve. "Does that mean I can call you Mommy now?" Jessica asked hopefully. Eve's eyes widened with surprise. She looked at Sam and he knew she didn't want to overstep some invisible boundary. Sam turned to his daughter and smiled. "Of course you can." Jessica smiled brightly as she took Eve's hand. "Come on, Mommy, let's go home." Just like that, Sam realized he was a married man again. He joined Eve and Jessica as they made their way to the wagon. He scooped his little girl up and deposited her in the back before helping his wife onto the seat. For the second time that day, their eyes met, and this time there was no uncertainty, only hope for the future. The trip from town to the ranch didn't take long. They arrived just as the sun began its descent in the west. After helping both Jessica and Eve out of the wagon, Jessica raced around, eager to give Eve a tour of their home. Once again, Eve glanced at Sam as if asking permission. He appreciated her consideration, but he wanted her to make herself at home. "Please, do go ahead. This is now your home just as much as it is ours." Sam collected her luggage and placed it on the porch before heading off to take care of the horses. Once the horses had been watered and put out to pasture, Sam found Eve and Jessica in the kitchen. Jessica was talking a mile a minute, explaining to Eve where everything was to be found. It was only then that Sam realized that he had been in such a hurry to get home that they had forgotten to eat at the diner. "Would you mind if I started making dinner?" Eve asked, as if knowing what was on his mind. "Why don't you settle in and Jessica and I can start with dinner?" Sam offered. "Only if you're sure," Eve said hesitantly. "Daddy, can I take Eve's trunk to her room?" Jessica asked, eager to help. Eve and Sam's gazes clashed, both finding the question awkward. Sleeping arrangements hadn't yet been discussed, and he didn't want to offend Eve by not inviting her into his room. "Daddy snores," Jessica announced suddenly, interrupting Sam's train of thought. He almost kissed his daughter for giving him an easy way to explain. "I do, terribly. Eve, I thought you might be more comfortable in the guest bedroom. Wouldn't want you to be disturbed by my snoring." Eve smiled gratefully, and it was clear that she hadn't been ready to share a bed either. "That sounds perfectly fine, thank you." If Sam had thought he was going to give Eve a moment to herself, he had been wrong. Jessica followed her down the hallway and remained at her side the entire time. He could hear his daughter's excited chatter from the kitchen. Although Eve was tired after her journey, she answered Jessica's questions and made her laugh until they joined him in the kitchen again. "Jessica, would you mind setting the table?" Eve asked, noticing that the fried eggs and ham were almost ready. Sam smiled to himself, knowing that only a mother knew such things. He had never been sure when to start giving his daughter chores, and within an hour of arriving, Eve had done it in a way that made Jessica excited to help. When the table was set, Eve pretended to inspect Jessica's efforts. "My Jessica, aren't you a big girl? Everything is precisely in the right place. Can I do it again tomorrow?" Sam chuckled from his place by the stove. "You can do it every single night if you choose." Outside the house, the wind began to howl, bringing with it cooler temperatures. Knowing that, although they didn't get snow or rain in winter in Texas, it could become quite chilly at night, Sam headed to the fireplace to toss a few logs on the fire. With the fire crackling and hissing warmth into the home, he returned to the kitchen to find that Eve had already plated their food. They had only known each other for a few hours, and Sam couldn't help appreciating how they already worked as a team. When he sat down at the dinner table between his daughter and his wife, Sam felt as if the page had been turned, and that this would be their first meal together as a new family. "Did you wash your ears?" Eve asked with a smile while she peeled the potatoes. Jessica splashed in the tub beside the fireplace with a laugh. "Yes, and my toes." Eve couldn't help but fall even deeper in love with the little girl. Like any other child her age, she did have her quirks and moments of being stubborn or difficult, but overall, she was simply a pleasure and a delight to have around. "Did you wash everything in between?" Eve called out, placing another peeled potato in the pot. "Even my belly, my knees, and my hands," Jessica answered with another splash. "Would you mind keeping the water in the tub? I've already washed the floors this week," Eve teased. Jessica giggled. "Do I have to get out? Can't I play just a little longer?" Eve's heart tugged, remembering Jane saying the same thing on so many occasions in the past. There was something mystical and magical about water for a child. Just as she had indulged Jane, she indulged Jessica. "Of course you can, but just a little while longer, before you shrivel up." Eve set the knife down along with the potato she had been peeling and walked over to the fireplace to add another log to the fire. It felt strange to be able to add wood whenever the fire turned to embers. For so many years, she had been so careful about wasting logs, and now she had an endless supply. A few days after her arrival, she had kept the fire low all through the day until Sam came in for lunch. When she explained about saving logs, Sam had led her to see the log pile behind the barn. He explained how throughout the year he chopped dead trees to build up enough stock to see them through winter. Eve had made sure she kept the fire blazing on colder days. It still felt strange not to have calluses and blisters on her hands and to go to bed feeling warm and cozy in winter. "There you go. Now don't spill more water or Daddy is going to be angry," Eve warned as she returned to the kitchen. It was late afternoon and Sam was finishing up outside for the day. After just a couple of weeks, Eve had come to learn his routine. At this time of day, he feed the barn animals, pumped water for the house, and then made sure everything was secured for the night before he took his position on the porch with a cup of coffee. On colder evenings, he would sit by the kitchen table and keep her company while she started on dinner. While dinner was cooking, he took the time to give Jessica her lessons. Eve had begun to help with that, but still allowed Sam to take the lead since she was still learning Jessica's capabilities. Her new life was so different from her life in New York that she couldn't even compare the two. Where she had only eaten enough to keep up her strength, here she could eat enough to regain the weight she had lost and renew her energy once again. The days were pleasant without snow or muddy sludge to brave outside, and as Christmas grew ever closer, Eve couldn't be more grateful not to have to spend another Christmas on her own. She looked out the window and saw Sam moving towards the water pump. He set the 3 buckets beside the water pump and began to fill the first. When he had filled the first bucket with water, he turned and looked towards the house. He looked directly at her, and Eve felt a blush coloring her cheeks for having been caught watching him. She dared herself to look away, but she couldn't. She didn't want to. When Sam looked at her in that way at that moment, something inside Eve felt whole again, as if she wasn't alone and no longer had to be afraid. Deep in her heart, she knew what the feeling meant, but she wasn't ready to admit it. She finally looked away as guilt washed over her. She had come to Texas to start a new life and to be a companion to Sam and a mother to his daughter. There had never been any hope of love or even a real marital relationship, and now, after just 2 weeks of living with Sam and Jessica, Eve knew that was what her heart yearned for. She didn't want to fall in love with Sam. She didn't want to follow her heart, because following her heart and accepting the emotions she had developed for Sam meant she would be betraying Henry. She had promised to love Henry until the day she died, and now she had made the same promise to another. She knew that widowers and widows remarried all the time, but she couldn't seem to get rid of the guilt that haunted her whenever her heart skipped a beat at the sight of Sam. His kindness, generosity, and the way he was with Jessica had caused Eve to admire and respect him. But it was the way he looked at her as if she was his future that made her fall in love with him. Eve wanted that future. She wanted to feel loved and cherished again. But how could she allow that with another man? She didn't want to betray Henry's memory and, least of all, lead Sam on if there wasn't going to be anything but friendship between them, which left her in an uncertain position. "I'm done," Jessica called from the fireplace. Eve glanced down, only to find almost nothing left of the potato she had been peeling. In its place was a large pile of peels. She let out a sigh before she went to help Jessica out the tub. Once Jessica was dried and dressed, Eve invited her onto her lap as she began to brush her hair. Without realizing it, Eve was humming Jane's favorite song, "Ba ba black sheep, have you any wool?" Jessica's sweet voice began to sing the words, making Eve's heart overflow with joy. When the door opened and Sam stepped inside, Eve turned to see his look of surprise. For a moment, he just stood there before a smile slowly curved his mouth. He was just as grateful as Eve that Jessica had welcomed her into their home, and she could see that Sam was pleased with the relationship she had with his daughter. Eve quickly returned her attention to Jessica's hair, reminding herself that Jessica was her main reason for being here. Falling in love with Sam was never on the table, and even if she managed to find a way past the guilt of betraying Henry, would Sam even feel the same? For the rest of the night, Eve kept to herself. She needed time to process her feelings and to find a way to ignore the connection she felt to Sam. The best way to complicate the easy friendship they had developed was to ask something of him he could never give her. A month after his wedding to Eve, Sam sat by the fireplace and listened as Eve told Jessica a bedtime story. As a father, he had told a few tales in the past, veering away from the traditional stories, but whenever Eve told a bedtime story, he found himself listening as eagerly as his daughter. Eve told stories about princes and castles, Indians and cows that could fly, and she even told stories about little girls who were rewarded for minding their manners and doing their lessons. She had a way of infusing each bedtime story with a lesson, and tonight's story was no different. Eve's voice drifted to him as she told Jessica a story about a poor little boy who didn't have a family. As she explained how the other children teased him and how he would run away and cry, Sam understood the night's lesson. Never judge and always be kind. A smile tilted the corners of his mouth as Eve's story came to an end. Sam couldn't be more grateful for Eve and the type of woman and mother she was. He had been hesitant to invite a stranger into his home, but he knew now without a single doubt in his mind that God's hand had been at work the entire time. Jessica had only been 5 years old when Louisa had passed away, and Sam often wondered if she still remembered her mother. But for now, he was grateful that she had a mother who could tell her stories, shower her with love, and teach her things that Sam never could. He would always make sure that Louisa's memory lived on, and one day he would tell his daughter all about her real mother. But for now, Eve was the mother who bathed her, sang to her, and taught her the difference between right and wrong. Ever since her arrival, Eve usually turned in soon after putting Jessica to bed. Sam didn't mind, but tonight he wanted to spend a little time with her. There were so many things he wanted to talk to her about, ask her opinion of, and find out about her that he couldn't do with Jessica around. He stood up and tossed a few more logs on the fire to ward off the December chill before he headed to the kitchen to brew a fresh pot of coffee. A short while later, Eve came out of Jessica's room with a smile of affection. "She's fast asleep. I had her do sums today. It always exhausts her. She's taken to the way you're giving her lessons. Perhaps it's time for me to step aside?" Sam said with a smile. Eve laughed. "You might regret that in a few years. I can teach her English and arithmetic and even a little history, but when it comes to Texas and ranching, she's better off learning from you." Sam chuckled in agreement. "Then that's the new arrangement. I've taken the liberty of making you some coffee." Eve frowned, a little confused. "Coffee?" "Yes, I thought we might sit by the fire and talk for a while. But if you'd rather turn in, I'll understand," Sam added quickly. Eve shook her head with a kind smile. "I'd like to sit by the fire and talk a while. I don't fall asleep until after midnight anyway." As she poured herself a cup of coffee, Sam watched her with a questioning look. "Why is that?" Eve shrugged and made her way to the fireplace. She sat down across from him and sipped on her coffee before she answered. "After years of working late into the night, I guess it's become a habit. A bad one, I might add. I still can't believe you managed alone for all that time in New York. It must have been terrifying at times." Eve was quiet for a long while before she answered. "There were times when I wished I could just be done with this life and join my Henry and Jane in heaven. At other times, I couldn't help but feel as if there was something better in my future. Most times, the two schools of thought collided." Sam chuckled in understanding. "I felt the same way when I lost Louisa." He said, "It felt as if I didn't have a reason to get up in the mornings, but luckily I had Jessica to keep me going. I can't imagine how hard it must have been for you." A tear slipped over Eve's cheek, but she quickly brushed it away. "That's in the past now." Sam couldn't sit there and not offer her support in some way. He set down his cup and took a seat beside her. He reached for the hand that rested on her knee and met her gaze when she turned to him with a surprised look. "I never want you to feel that way again, Eve. I want you to be happy. I want you to feel loved and cherished and protected, and to know that I will do anything in my power to stop you from suffering any hardships ever again." Sam's voice was low, the emotion clear as he spoke the words. Eve's hazel eyes softened with emotion. "I never want you to feel as if you don't have a reason to get up in the mornings. If the weight or the grief becomes too much to bear, you can talk to me. Just like I still think of Henry and Jane, I know you must still think of Louisa. I won't ever blame you for that." Sam felt his heart expand. He never knew how much one could love until meeting Eve. It was as if every day his heart grew a little more to make place for her. He squeezed her hand and smiled. "At least we have each other now. A second chance, a new beginning, the promise of a bright and blessed future." Sam searched her gaze. For a moment it was as if the past faded into the distance, and all that mattered was the two of them. There was no Henry haunting her gaze or Louisa weighing his heart down. There was only the affection they had come to feel for each other, their shared love for Jessica, and the hope of a new future. Guilt quickly made him snatch his hand away as if he had been burned. How could he fall in love with Eve when he had promised his heart to Louisa? For a few moments it had felt right, but now glancing around the room with his heart racing a mile a minute, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. He was falling in a love with Eve in the home he had built with Louisa. He was sharing Louisa's daughter with her. He made her bed with the quilt Louisa had sewn by hand. A little voice in the back of his mind taunted him. Hadn't he already shared enough with Eve? Did he really have to share his heart as well and commit the final act of betrayal? Before he could apologize for his abrupt behavior, Eve stood up and set her cup down in the kitchen. She didn't even bother to rinse it before she turned to him with a sad smile. "Sleep well, Sam?" Her voice was broken with emotion. Sam nodded. "You too, Eve." As he watched her disappear down the hallway to the spare bedroom, Sam realized that Eve must have felt the same. For a moment, they had allowed themselves to forget the past and to cherish their newborn love for each other, before the guilt and memory of their spouses had reminded them that they could only ever be friends. After a morning in town, Eve was eager to get back to the ranch. Usually, she enjoyed the trip and the opportunity to explore the little town more, but today only brought back memories of too many years ago. Every single merchant in town had Christmas decorations on display. Every decoration only reminded her of the last Christmas during which she had decorated her home. When she had excused herself from Sam and Jessica, claiming to need something from the stationery store, she had actually needed to find an escape, to try and find a way to suppress the memories that brought tears to her eyes. Ever since losing Jane, Christmas had become a time of mourning rather than a time of celebration. With Henry, Eve had never had to explain her feelings, because Henry had felt the same. After losing Jane, there had been no more decorations, Christmas trees, tinsel, or even gifts to celebrate the day. Instead, on the morning of Christmas Day, she and Henry would have made their way to the cemetery to put flowers on their daughter's grave. The flowers had been so expensive that they could barely afford a ham for Christmas, but neither Eve nor Henry would have wanted it any other way. For the first time since arriving in Texas, Eve wondered if she had come at a good time. Perhaps she should have waited until January, when she could have spent a whole year with Sam and Jessica, before she had to explain to them how difficult Christmas was for her. Instead, she now found herself between two fires, both blazing equally high. On the one side, she had Jessica, eager to decorate the house in celebration of Christmas Day that was only 2 weeks away. On the other side, she had the memories of her past, drowning her joy and reminding her that she no longer had a daughter of her own. If she indulged Jessica, it would feel as if she had forgotten Jane altogether. And if she clung to the memories of Jane, she would ruin Christmas for both Sam and Jessica. She took a moment in the stationery store, staring at envelopes as she tried to gather her thoughts and ease her conflicting emotions. "Can I help you, dear?" the clerk suddenly asked, stifling Eve. Eve turned around with a smile in place to explain that she was only browsing when she was faced with a shelf featuring Christmas cards. Her throat was clogged with emotion before tears began to sting her eyes. She turned and all but ran out of the store, eager to get away from all the reminders of what Christmas had once been. She didn't even bother to find Sam or Jessica first, but rushed to the wagon and decided to wait for them there. She would apologize to Sam later for her poor behavior, but she was better off alone now than risking making a fool of herself in town. Eve noticed Sam and Jessica the moment they stepped out of the store onto the boardwalk. Jessica was holding onto a box of Christmas decorations, talking a mile a minute. But Sam glanced towards the wagon, his brow creasing when he saw Eve sitting there alone. For a moment, their eyes held before Sam said something to Jessica and headed towards the diner. Eve couldn't help but understand that he would rather keep Jessica away from her when she was upset, and resigned herself to waiting in the wagon until Jessica had the slice of cake she had been promised that morning. When Sam stepped out of the diner a few moments later, rushing towards the wagon, Eve frowned with confusion. She expected him to be angry for spoiling their day in town, but instead, he stopped beside her and held out his hand. "Come, let's you and me take a walk." "But what about Jessica? She wanted to eat her cake," Eve said, not wanting to ruin the girl's treat. Sam shook his head. "She's visiting with Norma from the diner. She'll no doubt have more than one slice of cake." He saw the confused expression on Eve's face and continued. "I told Norma I wanted to take my wife for a stroll to the pond." "There's a pond in town?" Eve asked, surprised. "Yes, as a matter of fact, there is. It isn't large and there ain't no ducks, but it's a pond." Sam offered his hand again. Appreciating that he'd arranged for them to take a walk together, Eve accepted his hand and climbed down from the wagon. Sam slipped her hand through the crook of his elbow as they walked. For the first time, it felt as if they were a real married couple and not just friends raising Jessica together. Eve was quiet, still lost in her own mind as they walked. When they finally reached the pond, Sam turned to her with a concerned expression. I promised to make you happy, and I can't help but feel that you're not happy today. Is it something I did? Eve's heart swelled with love for the kind and patient man. No, it's nothing you did. It's nothing. I'll be fine in a while. I just needed some time to myself. Sam shook his head and took a hold of both of Eve's hands. Eve, I don't want you to be fine in a while, especially not if something is bothering you. Talk to me. Tell me what is on your mind. Eve hesitated for a moment. She stepped to the left of that fire in her mind and to the right before she found herself stuck in the middle again. She let out a heavy sigh before shaking her head. I'm sorry, Sam. It's just this time of year. It takes me back to when we lost Jane. Sam's brows furrowed with concern. Was that before Christmas? Eve nodded as a tear slipped over her cheek. 4 years tomorrow. We knew she wasn't going to make it until Christmas, so we lied to her and decorated the house early. We celebrated Christmas on the 10th of December, and she passed away the following day. I'm so sorry, Eve. Sam drew her in for a hug and held her close. For a few moments, Eve felt safe and protected, but that didn't change the way she felt about Christmas. She stepped back and searched his gaze. I haven't celebrated Christmas ever since. I know Jessica wants us to decorate the house and start baking cookies, just like I used to do, but it makes me too sad to do it again. Sam framed her face and searched her eyes. Eve expected him to be cross with her for not wanting to give his daughter a Merry Christmas, but instead, a slow smile curved his mouth. Thank you for telling me. Now I understand why you needed to get out of the merchant's store. I'm sorry I should have stayed, Eve quickly apologized. Sam's heart ached for Eve. He couldn't imagine losing his daughter, but to lose a child so close to Christmas was a time of magic, sparkles, and wonder for children. Without children, it all seemed unnecessary. He couldn't even blame Eve for not celebrating Christmas after losing her daughter. He wished he could take her heartache away. He wished that he could wipe the sadness from her eyes and have them light up with laughter again. But just as with everything else, there was a time for laughter and a time for sorrow. Don't apologize for feeling the way you do. Don't ever feel the need to apologize for your feelings, Sam insisted quietly. If I had to lose Jessica, I can't even imagine it. I want you to tell me more about Jane, about what she liked and what she didn't. I'd like to know what made her laugh and what made her sad. You do? Eve asked, confused. Sam nodded. Jane and Henry are a part of you, a part of the person you have become. Of course I'd like to know more about them. Eve smiled sadly. I'd like to talk about her. Then perhaps instead of seeing Christmas as a reminder of losing her, think of it as a celebration of her life. A celebration where both of us were given a second chance at happiness. A celebration of having Jessica in your life. You'll never forget her, neither will I, but she would have wanted you to be happy, don't you think? Sam's voice was gentle as he spoke. Eve searched his gaze and wondered if he was right. For so many years, she had experienced Christmas as a reminder of what she had lost, instead of celebrating all the Christmases she had been blessed to share with her daughter. She thought of Jessica and her eagerness to decorate the house and to put up a tree, and couldn't help but find a smile curve the corners of her mouth. Perhaps helping Jessica find joy in Christmas would help Eve to find joy in her memories of Jane instead of grief in her death. What if it doesn't work? Eve asked in a small voice. Of course it won't work every minute of every day. Sam's voice was warm, but when you find yourself overwhelmed by the memories and the sadness of it all, that's when you come to me. I'm here to share your woes and your sadness, not just the joy we plan to find in the future. Sam's heart swelled, knowing that his words held truth. He wanted a future with Eve, a future filled with joy and many more Christmases. He might feel as if he was betraying Louisa by falling in love with Eve, but wouldn't Louisa have wanted him to be happy? I appreciate it. Really, I do. Eve smiled gratefully. We'd best get back to the diner before Jessica eats herself into a tummy ache. Sam laughed. In such a short time, Eve had stepped into the role of mother to his little girl. She was just as concerned about Jessica's well-being as he was. And the best part was knowing that Jessica loved having a mother to fuss over her. "You're right, let's go save her from Norma's cakes." As they walked back to the thoroughfare, Sam felt something inside him shift. He couldn't ask Eve to find joy in the present and to let go of the sorrow and memories of the past if he wasn't willing to do it himself. For the last few weeks, he had tried to ignore the feelings he had for Eve. But how much longer could he wager a war between his past and his future? What had meant to be a moment of support and honesty for Eve had turned into a moment of honesty with himself and his own heart. Eve stood back, pleased with the beautiful Christmas tree. It was hard to imagine that only a few days ago she wanted nothing to do with Christmas, and now she was making this the best Christmas ever. Of course, her heart still ached when she thought of Jane and all the Christmases she would never have, but she found solace in knowing that her little girl was in heaven, celebrating Jesus' birthday with the angels. When she had retreated to the wagon, she had expected Sam to be impatient and find her complaints a nuisance, but instead, he had spoken to her with patience and kindness and had made her realize that she couldn't hang on to the grief of the past forever. "It's the most pretty tree we've ever had," Jessica said proudly as she rushed to Eve's side. Eve laughed. "The prettiest tree, you mean?" "Prettiest," Jessica repeated. "I never thought you could use pine cones as decorations." Jessica's eyes traveled to the ceiling and the string after string of pine cones that hung there. The house even smelled of Christmas. "That's right. Anything can become a Christmas decoration if you use it right," Eve explained as she moved towards the box by the fireplace. They had started off storing everything they needed for decorations inside it, but since yesterday, it now housed their secret project. Eve picked up the box and moved it to the kitchen table, knowing that Sam wouldn't be home for a while yet. He had gone to check on the cattle in the far field, allowing her and Jessica to continue working on their secret project. "Mommy, what are we going to do with all these sticks? We've gathered so many I can't even count them anymore," Jessica asked with wide, curious eyes as she looked into the box. Eve's mouth curved into a smile. The idea had come to her the day before, when Sam had told her how much work had gone into building the house they now called home. He had explained how he and Louisa had cut trees and used the wagon to drag the lumber back home. They lived in a tent for almost a year before the house was ready. The house Eve now called home. Although she and Sam couldn't start their new lives by building a new home, she and Jessica could give them something for Christmas as a future reminder of their first Christmas together as a family. "There are so many sticks in this box because you and I are going to tie them together and create a tiny house that looks just like the one we live in," Eve explained as she began placing the sticks on the table. "We can do that?" Jessica asked, captivated by the idea. "Of course we can, my angel. We can do anything we put our minds to as long as we trust in the Lord," Eve said, pressing a kiss to Jessica's head. After barely a month, she had come to love Jessica as if she were her own. She already understood from a simple word or expression when Jessica was sad or upset and when she needed a hug or to be disciplined. Eve had thought being a mother again would be hard, but she found it to be the one thing she enjoyed doing more than anything in the world. She didn't mind the laundry, the cooking, or even the cleaning, because when it was done, it meant she could spend the rest of the day with her daughter. Together they would play, bake, and learn about the world, creating a bond stronger than Eve had ever imagined. For a moment, her heart twinged, wishing that she could do something like that to strengthen her bond with Sam as well. It felt as if every time they became closer, something began pulling them apart again. Eve knew in her case it was her memories of Henry, but she had also come to accept that she wanted happiness again. Henry would have wanted that for her, just like she would have wanted that for him. But it seemed harder for Sam. Shezig. She saw him going to the hill on which Louisa was buried from time to time. She could see him see Louisa in Jessica's laughter, and she could feel him withdraw whenever a moment became too long. If someone had told Eve that preparing for Christmas would help her deal with her grief, she would have thought them crazy. But now, after decorating for the last few days, she knew it had been exactly the medicine her heart had needed. Just like her hands had needed that foul-smelling balm in New York, her heart needed to ache and grieve one final time before it could heal and prepare her for loving another. But her greatest fear was that Sam would never heal and come to love her. "How are we going to build it?" Jessica asked, interrupting her thoughts. Eve demonstrated by selecting a few twigs of the same length, which she began to thread together to create a panel. When the panel was done, she tied a knot and held it up for Jessica to see. "There you go. We need 3 more panels like this for the walls, and then 2 more for the roof. Why don't you start sorting twigs that are the same length into heaps?" Eager to help, Jessica began to make small piles of twigs all over the table. After merely an hour of working on their secret project, the first 4 panels were done. Eve knew they still had to do the porch, and perhaps even try to make flowers to put in front of the porch. But for now, they had to put everything away before Sam caught on to their secret. They had just put the box back in its place beside the Christmas tree when Sam opened the door and stepped inside. "What?" His eyes widened as he glanced around the living room. The Christmas tree stood tall by the fireplace, glorious with all its baubles and candles. Pine cones decorated the ceiling, even as paper decorations had been wrapped around every possible surface. His laughter was warm and filled with pleasure as he shook his head. "Did Christmas fairies come to visit while I was away?" he asked, pretending to be baffled as he scooped Jessica into his arms. Jessica's laughter was contagious as she shook her head. "No, Daddy, Mommy and I did all of it." Sam turned to Eve with a warm smile, and although there was gratitude in his eyes, she found herself wishing she could have received a warm hug as well. "Do you like it?" Sam nodded eagerly. "I don't like it. I simply love it." "Tomorrow we're baking cookies. You're going to love that as well, Daddy." Eve simply laughed, knowing that by the time Christmas arrived, she was going to be exhausted, but she also knew it would be a Christmas she would never forget. Sam woke up on Christmas morning feeling a weight on his shoulders even as he lay in bed. It had been there over the last couple of weeks, and he knew that unless he dared to let it go, it would stay with him forever. He reached for his pocket watch on the bedside table, surprised to see it wasn't even 5 o'clock yet. Although he was an early riser in the warmer months, in winter, he allowed himself to rest until at least 7 o'clock when the sun began to make its appearance. Regardless of the time, he pushed back the blankets and climbed out of bed. He dressed and pulled on his boots, ready to start his day when he saw Louisa's photo still gracing the dresser beside the window. He hadn't considered putting it away until now. Knowing that there would be time for that another day, he quietly moved through the house before stepping onto the porch. He didn't want to wake Eve and Jessica. For what he was about to do, he needed privacy. He crossed the yard to the barn, the horse nickering at the scent of him. He walked past the 2 mares he used for the wagon before taking a younger mare out of her stable. He saddled her with hands that had done the same thing 1,000 times before he swung himself onto her back. The air was cold as they walked out of the barn. His breath escaped in small white clouds of cotton, even as the morning chill pinked his cheeks and his nose. He didn't mind the cold. In fact, he welcomed it. It woke him and refreshed his mind for what he wanted to do. He carefully navigated the horse in the dark towards the hill on which the large oak tree stood. The horse lost her footing once or twice, but regained it every time. By the time they reached the top, the sun's first rays kissed the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape. Sam drew in a deep breath as he dismounted and prayed for courage. He moved towards Louisa's grave and kneeled beside her headstone. A tear slipped over his cheek, but he knew he was doing the right thing. Over the last few visits to her grave, Sam had told her about Eve and how happy Jessica was to have her in their lives. But today he wasn't here to talk about Jessica or what made her happy. Another tear followed the first as he took his hat off and held it to his chest. "My dearest Louisa, how I've missed having you around. I miss the sound of your laughter, the scent of your hair on my pillow, and most of all, I miss having you in my life. I never thought that I could live without you. but I had to for our daughter. When I began to write to Eve, I only thought of you and what you would have wanted for Jessica. But now, Sam paused for a moment, fighting through the emotion in his voice. Now I know that you would have wanted me to be happy too. Eve makes me happy, Louisa. She makes me laugh. She makes me feel as if I can conquer the world. She makes me feel loved and appreciated. Until now, I've fought these feelings out of respect for your memory, but I realize now that was wrong. He glanced over the horizon and saw his house standing in the valley and knew it was time to say what he had come to say. It's time for me to say goodbye. It's time for me to move on and find joy and love for a second time around. I know you'll understand. I love you, Louisa, but I love Eve as well. Merry Christmas, my darling. The weight shifted off his shoulders as the sun rays caught his face. He felt their warmth penetrate his skin and renew him with energy and hope. When he stood up from Louisa's grave, Sam knew it was time to embrace the present, to let go of the past, and to spend Christmas with his new wife. He hopped into the saddle, and this time he didn't take it slow. As if sensing his urgency, the mare began to gallop, eager to return home. The tears on his cheeks dried in the wind, and the grief of losing Louisa lifted from his heart. He would no longer feel guilty or regret falling in love with Eve. Instead, he was about to make her understand that he wanted a future, real marriage, and all the happiness they could find. Merry Christmas, Mommy. Jessica jumped on the bed and began to bounce. Eve smiled through her sleep, fighting her way to wakefulness. It was the first time Jessica had come to wake her up, and the moment was just as special as the little girl with sleep-mussed hair laughing excitedly. Merry Christmas, my angel, Eve said, trying to blink the sleep from her eyes. Did you have a good rest? Yes, come on, Mommy, get up. We have to go and see if Santa came. Jessica tugged at the blankets, leaving Eve shivering from the cold. Yes, let's go see. And while we're at it, we should add logs to the fire. Eve shivered as she pulled on a nightgown before following Jessica into the living room. Last night, when Jessica had fallen asleep, Eve had wrapped her gifts and Sam had carefully placed them under the tree to keep the mystery of Santa alive. The only gift that Santa didn't bring was the one Jessica now held in her hands as she carefully placed it with all the other gifts. Can I open them yet? Jessica asked with bright eyes. Eve laughed. Coffee first. I mean logs on the fire, then coffee. Besides, we have to wait for your father. Before she could wait for Jessica's pout, Jessica raced down the hallway towards her father's bedroom. Eve sighed as she put a pot of coffee on the stove, wishing it would brew quickly so that she would have the energy to match Jessica's. He's not here, Jessica called out from the hallway. Eve frowned, concerned. He's not? No, Jessica said, rushing back into the kitchen. Did Santa take him? Her eyes began to tear just as the front door opened and Sam stepped inside. Merry Christmas, Sam called out in a cheerful voice. Eve smiled at him, wondering where he had been. Merry Christmas, you're up early. Sam shrugged. There was something I had to do. Daddy, can we open our gifts now? Jessica all but pleaded. Sam shook his head. Afraid not. Little girls have to be dressed and their beds made before they open their gifts. Jessica crossed her arms with a doubtful look. Who says? I say, Sam said with a firm smile. Jessica sighed and quickly rushed back down the hall. Eve glanced at Sam, surprised by this rule. Before she could ask him about it, he moved towards her and met her gaze. I needed a moment alone with you, he said by way of explanation. Eve frowned with a questioning look. Is something wrong? Sam nodded. Eve felt her heart contract with fear. She had suffered enough heartache through losing her daughter at this time of year. She didn't want to lose Sam and Jessica as well. Tears began to well in her eyes as she dropped her gaze to the ground. Sam gently tilted her chin so that he could see her eyes before a smile curved the corners of his mouth. It's wrong that I have been hesitant to accept my feelings for you. It's wrong that I felt I was betraying Louisa's memory by loving you. And most of all, it's wrong to live a lie. I know I said I wanted a companion, but I was wrong. I only realized that over these last few days, I want a real marriage. I want to hold you whenever you're sad, and I want you to know that you are safe in my arms. I want you to share my room and to share my dreams, and not only to share my daughter. Eve's eyes widened at the words she had been hoping to hear for weeks. Was she still asleep? Was this a dream? Sam took her left hand and carefully held out a piece of twine before searching her gaze. Would you be my wife, Eve? My real wife in every way that matters? I love you, and although I never expected to feel this way again, I'm grateful and blessed to have found you. Eve's breath caught with joy and emotion. You love me? Sam nodded. I do. I love your kindness, your sweetness, the way you are with Jessica, and most of all, I love the way I feel when I'm with you. Eve's laughter was filled with emotion as she began to nod. I love you too. I was afraid you didn't feel the same way. Is that a yes then? Sam asked hopefully. Eve nodded as she held out her hand. Yes, with all my heart. Sam tied the twine over her ring finger before pulling her into his arms. He brushed a soft kiss over her lips before he stepped back and met her gaze with a smile of joy. Merry Christmas, my love. I'm dressed, Jessica announced, bouncing into the kitchen. Sam and Eve laughed as they followed Jessica to the tree. As Jessica began to open her gifts, Eve collected the one Santa didn't bring and gave it to Sam. Merry Christmas, my love. Sam carefully opened the box, curious to see what was inside. When he pulled out the small wooden house, his eyes widened with surprise. You made this? Jessica and I made it. It was my way of telling you that I wanted us to build a new life together as a real man and wife. Sam's hand reached for hers before he leaned closer and whispered into her ear. You've just given me the best gift a man can ask for, a heart and a home. As Eve watched Jessica open her gifts with Sam's hand still in hers, she closed her eyes and thanked the Lord. For such a long time, she hadn't thought that happiness would ever be an option in her life, that survival was her only choice. And now she had a husband, a daughter, and a new future. Eve had always been doubtful of miracles, and when it came to Christmas miracles, she'd been completely certain that they didn't exist. But she only had to look around the room, feel the love and joyful spirit of Christmas to know that Christmas miracles did exist. You didn't always know when to expect them, and you couldn't always be sure that one would come your way. But when you did, you had to grab it with both hands and hang on tight, because a Christmas miracle was God's way of celebrating the birth of his son.